Hi, I'm Anne-Marie Harrison from Ideas Afresh Education, and I'm delighted to be working with Witherslack Group again today to be thinking about and really sort of tuning in to understanding more deeply autism and how that impacts on, in particular, our girls, and sort of what we might notice in our families between ourselves and between perhaps relatives and friends and sometimes cousins, mixing with other people's children. And we're going to take a chance to share some of our individual experiences and have a look at some of those that I've personally experienced. And also, we'll be thinking about some practical strategies, some things that you can perhaps take away, have a think about, and maybe try and put in place yourselves. And if there is anything that we talk about today or we touch on today that you think actually just like a little bit more clarification or a bit more information on that, then please don't hesitate to contact me either directly or via Witherslack. We're always happy to pick up on any other sort of queries or questions that you might have. And I'm going to start off with a little bit of irony today, because one of the terms I think that has become very popular over the years has been to do with the fact that actually our girls aren't just necessarily presenting with what has been classically identified over the last 3 or 4 decades, really, as autism. And then that got labelled in the diagnostic manuals as autism spectrum disorders. And a lot of people feel uncomfortable with those kind of terms. They perhaps feel they don't really define anything about the person that they love and live with. And in fact, some of the diagnostic labels, some of the channels that we have to go down in order to pursue a diagnosis sometimes feel like a real uncomfortable sort of misfit and don't necessarily slot directly into place. And interestingly, and this is where the irony is, a lady called Judy Singer wrote this book in 2016 called Neurodiversity, The Birth of an Idea. And the reason I say irony or ironically is because there she is, a female, talking about the fact that actually for her experience of autism, both personally, and she defines herself as the daughter of a mother on the spectrum, the mother of a daughter on the spectrum, and a person somewhere on the spectrum herself. And yet she also points out that actually the word neurodiversity did not come out of the blue, but was the culmination of her academic research and a lifetime of personal experiences. And here I think is the relevant bit. She says of exclusion, invalidation, as a person in a family affected by hidden disability, a person that was sort of neither recognised in society for what it really was and not really recognised amongst shared experiences amongst other people. And she says here, and this is where it leads us nicely into our webinar today, she says here, nevertheless, we sure knew how to shield ourselves from the critical neurotypical gaze and developed plenty of strategies to try to pass, and this is her words, not mine, for normal. And of course, there in our title today is Autism, Girls and Masking. And really, if we wanted to strip back all the sort of media coverage and all sort of what we hear about masking these days, then actually she summarises it in a very human, down-to-earth sort of way. And whilst we don't like the word normal, and certainly, as professionals, we steer very clear of those kind of categorizing terms like normal. But in reality, she's saying that that's what she was trying to be, trying to pretend, trying to mask, trying to copy, trying to imitate. So that's about how we are presenting ourselves. That's about how we are, and I don't kind of use the word choosing carefully, because it's about how we are choosing to display ourselves to the world. And of course, indeed, to an extent, a mask is sometimes a helpful thing to wear. And I think it is important that our autistic girls know and understand that everybody wears a mask sometimes, and often that mask forms its most recognizable place in the workplace, because we all wear a different mask sometimes when we are slipping into work mode to what we might be if, you know, we're just with our partner or with our loved and familiar others. So presentations are about, to an extent as well, I think, assumptions and presumptions. And so things like families will have shared things like their daughter is, you know, she's too successful, or she fits in too well, or she gets on with everyone. So how do we tell if someone is presenting with autism? I think the problem is that a lot of diagnostic misconceptions can really affect even like the most qualified psychologists. And I know the Attitude magazine back in November last year highlighted in an article, what do autistic women and girls present themselves like? And we don't really need to look that far for the moment, at the moment, to notice that media coverage of females and girls sharing about their diagnosis of autism, of ADHD, neurodiversity, but that in reality, they're just like all individuals who are autistic, who have that neurodiverse brain. They've always been there. But I think perhaps what's happened is they've been misunderstood and underdiagnosed and overlooked. But they've always been a part of our society. And I think autism screening process for diagnosis has been perhaps unintentionally, but has been more designed to recognise some of that sort of male presentation, some of those more masculine ways even of playing, of behaving. You know, if little girls line up the dollies for a tea party, nobody questions that. But if little boys line their cars up right on the edge of the windowsill and don't sort of line them up as if they're, you know, in a traffic jam on the M25 or whatever, then already people start having some sort of curiosities about their behaviours. Whereas I think sometimes the curiosities about some of our girls' behaviours, some of their early presentations, are in danger of getting missed. And I think, you know, it might be that to sort of help us really to sort of understand that is if we think about some of the social interactions and the behaviours, you know, these are the areas where we perhaps hear labels like, oh, she's so shy, or she's timid, or she's an extrovert, or a show off, or boisterous. And we get all of those kind of cultural and social allowances, but also we get those sort of boundaries and social bias. And then we might have things like to think about around sort of executive conduct, you know, and these are the areas that society sort of explains away as our children perhaps being labelled as butterfly brained or scatty or very focused, very organised, very precise, extremely committed, and oh so stubborn. But actually, what's really happening here is we're just seeing that manifestation of some of those social boundaries and biases that we witness in our culture. So no wonder we're a bit confused and we kind of find ourselves floating around the whole idea of, well, is there a sufficient difference in the behavior? Is there sufficient difference in the interactions with the family, with life, with the environment to actually be of any concern? You know, am I looking for things? Are these presentations real? Or am I making presumptions? And of course, sometimes we get clues from the sensory behavior or the sensory world, but again, we might excuse those away as being a fussy or faddy eater, or just being a bit awkward, or perhaps just being a little bit determined and likes their own way, or just loves one particular colour coat or one particular jumper, or will only wear such a thing, and so on. So then actually that kind of leads into what we see when we look at these behaviors. You know, are we looking at someone who we excuse away as just loving playing with the same thing, or is so interested in the same thing, or prefers to just do the same thing? We might even start and look for broader labels, like we might say, oh, she's such a comedian, or just loves the fantasy world. She thinks she's Elsa out of Frozen, or, you know, she thinks she's a princess. She's such a princess. And of course, all of these are acceptable or excused away, as it were. But if it was a little boy that was equally as committed to perhaps pretending to be a dog, then alarm bells perhaps sometimes ring a little bit sooner than they would ordinarily. So when we're thinking about what we're noticing and we're thinking about presentations, then I think it is important that we do remain mindful of some of the presumptions that we do make, and that we, I think as a culture really, we're very good at excusing away certain behaviours. And I think sometimes the evidence points that we're particularly good at doing that for our little girls who we perhaps are noticing are behaving a little bit differently to their peers, or they're not interacting and involving themselves in family or social life in the same way that their peers are. So let's just have a think about sort of why that might be. Because in reality, sometimes it's just that our girls are, you know, seeing the world through a very different lens. So what do families comment on seeing? Or what should we be looking out for? And of course, lots of that depends on whose lens we're looking through too. And often families report that the differences in behaviours occur between home and school. I'm working with a number of families at the minute who are saying, you know, one of their biggest difficulties is that school just do not see the same sort of presentation. And so they are guilty really of making assumptions that the child they see at school is the child that should be seen at home. And of course, for, as we well know, for many, many children who are autistic, who have associated neurodiversities, then they can learn very well to present themselves, to mirror behaviours, to copy behaviours, and to fit in fairly well in some respects. But of course, that can be very tiring if we're doing that all day, every day. And as we'll talk about a little bit later on, I think we can't underestimate the importance that it has for us all to be able to be ourselves. And we might not all be ourselves all of the time, but we need to be able to know and understand who we are in order that we can, in fact, be ourselves for the majority of the time. So it's no wonder that sometimes we even notice that behaviours are different at school, but also maybe at grandma's house. And then, of course, that can cause difficult sort of conversations and implications and probably assumptions too in families as well. So when we reflect really on how subjective our autism really is and the characteristics of autism, then it's not surprising that it is so important for us to follow our instincts. And, I often say to families, don't lose sight of your gut instinct. And I have to say, hand on heart, I've been working with families for over 30 years, and I don't think I've ever met a family who wanted their child to be going down a different developmental path. And not because we don't recognize the creativity and the enthusiasm and the joy and the fun. And, I speak, as many of you know, from both a personal and professional and, broader family perspective. I work in this field, but I have a lived and a shared experience with you all. And within my family, I'd be lying if I sat here and didn't say, I went through the whole roller coaster of emotions. When my relatives were sort of going through and myself through sort of diagnosis. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that and that we are honest and open about it, because that helps us to move on together and to journey together and to recognize that actually, many of these different traits that our children demonstrate actually have got great potential, but we just need to support them and ourselves in tapping into them. And so, parents often do start to use words like, she's a bit inflexible, and she can be very oversensitive, and she's quite rigid and a bit tricky to handle, and sometimes she can be really unpredictable and sort of in her own world, and these are the realities, these are the real sort of down to earth experiences and kinds of behaviors that we often know to sort of getting in the way developmentally. And sometimes, we don't sort of see beyond those. And yet, for many of our girls, if we looked at the neurotypical or the more traditional developmental milestones, then in some of those milestones, our girls can often be way beyond where we would expect to see them. So things like the language acquisition may be, really fabulous. And for other girls, it might not be quite so. And that I've always found, certainly in the kind of history of my working experience, it's been a really interesting area to think about, because for some of my experience, certainly in the early days of working in the field with the National Autistic Society, many early diagnosed girls that were coming forward in those days tended to be sort of pre-verbal little girls who were presenting with what would have in those days been described as more sort of severe or marked autism. And the youngest little girl that I ever worked with a diagnosis was only 2. And that, is very young to get a diagnosis. And yet nowadays, we are hearing about and meeting women and teenagers and young, university students coming forwards quite later on with a very clear autistic and sometimes associated, neurodiverse profile as well. And yet people say, well, where were these children, 10 years ago? But of course, they were there just the same as they were in, classrooms of all generations. It's about recognition that we are hopefully moving in the right direction. And you know, I often, as I say, the first sentence out of a parent's mouth when they call me often is, I'm worried Lucy just isn't like her friends, or she's not like her sister was at this same age. And I think that, I would never dismiss that. I think that is, a parent's gut instinct. And, it is important, and it doesn't have to be such sort of dramatic noticing or realization at this early stage. It's just important that we're starting to recognize and realize that we might need to support people differently. And, some of the kind of psychological diagnostic terms will be, much more evident than that. We might be talking about social impairments or social and emotional differences. We might be talking about emotional regulation, sensory processing, the environmental influences, executive functioning, differences in our theory of mind, in how we understand and work out other people's intentions and what other people are thinking they might do, other people's ideas. And so it's not surprising that sometimes we disconnect with our gut instinct and our early just mum, dad, grandma, auntie recognitions of that slightly differently developing little girl in our family. So some of the indicators might be a little bit more obvious, and we might have one of those little girls who she'll start and get dressed, but then she needs to put her shoes on but can't get her shoes on, so mum tells me that then she has to strip off again and start the whole routine again, because sometimes for our children, breaking in to an established routine can be very difficult for them. And so that routine has to be sort of recompleted. And I certainly know, guys who I've chatted to about this, and, they'll say kind of shaving can create that same sort of sense of you've got to start again if for some reason you get interrupted or broken off. And certainly I've identified that in families who are talking about working with little girls. And sometimes it's masked by the girl changing her mind about what clothes she wants to wear. Well, of course, that achieves a very different label, doesn't it? That makes us think, oh, well, she's just being fussy about what she wants to wear, or she can't make a decision. But actually, sometimes that is a way of sort of managing that real deep down inherent need to complete that routine from start to finish. So I guess what I'm saying really here is that it's not right, and it wouldn't be right for any of us to just dismiss these worries, because actually, worries can be useful. And I think in this context, they can be very useful in helping us to flag up if there is a concern. We need to do something to alleviate it. It's not good to just ignore it, no matter what age. It's never too early to start and support our autistic girls. And we don't need a label for that. And sadly, we're in a culture where waiting for diagnosis, waiting for processes to take place, trying to get education, health and care plans in situ. I know frustratingly, just as you do, how lengthy and how mind-blowing and how difficult some of all that can actually be. So I think sometimes when we come back with, and I think this happens in families a lot, don't worry, I'm sure it will be fine. Actually, that's one of the most sort of overused and confusing statements I think that we ever really make to one another. And I think it's really just to improve how we feel about a situation, and often if it's coming from, you know, a loved one, it's to try and appease and try and make us feel better. But of course, you know, both as a trainer and a qualified professional in the neurodiverse arena, and with my lived personal and family experiences, it taught me a long time ago that the best way to alleviate a worry is to do something about it. And I think, you know, this may be sort of rationalizing out the situation. For me, it might be taking some exercise and finding some headspace to try and work out sort of what's going on, and try and attempt perhaps more rational thoughts and dispel some of the sort of worry demons that can take over. But I think rationalizing things out and reasoning things out and making a plan, thinking what can we do about this? How can we move forward with this? I think these techniques are often sort of cited as, you know, good techniques for us as adults to use, but actually they're also great techniques for us to use with our daughters as well. And I think sometimes dismissing worries and that sort of thing can really start to sort of root those thoughts around masking. You know, are we masking? Are we avoiding? Are we pretending? And, you know, we are guilty of that if we aren't addressing the concerns and the worries that we've got about our child's development, then we are guilty of masking, avoiding, and pretending. So we'll have a look. And I think, you know, as I say, we can't dismiss sometimes these skills can be useful sort of in the workplace or whatever. But of course, the other thing that we need to be mindful of is the fact that for many of our girls, and maybe even for us as parents, that sometimes our memory of experiences and our memory of our own sort of personal history can be blurred around the edges. And certainly for autistic women, we can experience these occasions where perhaps our memory isn't quite as accurate in some ways, because maybe an experience has taken over the reality of a memory or a sensory, and that could have been a sensory experience at the time. So it could be if you're just overwhelmed with something that you heard, or overwhelmed with what was happening at the time, you know, even someone's aftershave or perfume, then that can actually inhibit us taking on information and remembering it and then being able to relay it. So whilst I think it is important to not dismiss a worry, I think it's important too that we try and make quite accurate records of the experiences that we are having with our girls. Because if we can pursue our concerns sort of via our GP or via Senkos in school, then having accurate information on board about those worries can be really helpful. So I think, you know, being aware of that diagnostic criteria that we've mentioned, so the social differences, the sensory differences, the differences in behaviour, and noting all of those can be really, really important and really useful. So let's move on and have a look at some of the individual experiences. But as I've just said, tied up in the individual experiences is also some of the commonalities, some of the you know, recalling and memorizing experiences, some of the flexibility or inflexibility, some of the emotional regulating that will have occurred. So important that we don't lose sight of understanding and really kind of finding our girls' groove, finding and helping them to know what they love, helping them to know what they enjoy can be really important. So we'll go through the ages here with some experiences. So I'm at the moment, working with families with autistic daughters, where masking really does manifest itself in many different guises. And as I say, the media is full of film stars like Daryl Hannah in Blade Runner. She was diagnosed at 5 years of age, and her first sort of parents' worries on that previous slide, her worries were that she was painfully shy, and her mum was distraught because she used to cry herself to sleep. And she says in herself that her entire school career was a struggle. And I think, that's a real kind of hard one, isn't it? And yet, there she is now, a successful film star. And then the Olympic medalist, Jessica Jane Applegate, and the Olympic swimmer, she commented that just hearing the water sort of, slush sort of through her hands and glide through her hands is just amazing. She says, "It's what I love most about swimming. It was somewhere I could escape to. I felt a sense of normalcy. It was something I enjoyed too." And I think, isn't that incredible that actually, there we are watching a swimmer, and the last thing I imagine on our mind when we're watching the Olympic swimming is, oh, I wonder if she's enjoying the noise of the water going through her fingers as she swims. And I think, that's just a wonderful example and a wonderful image of how for many of our autistic girls, their sensory processing, their sensory experiences are giving them sort of a hugely more pleasurable time than perhaps we always allow for or we consider. And so I think, we all perhaps have heard recently of Christine McGuinness, the model, who shared her experiences on the BBC Our Family and Autism programme fairly recently. And I think my lived and real experiences, include Emily, a lively 3-year-old little girl, who, when I went to do a home visit with her, I was told exactly where to sit and exactly what I could and couldn't play with. And she will have a clear agenda of how your presence in the house is going to be tolerated by her. And of course, that's the important thing, that we know that that is not about power and control. That's about her making things tolerable, making things so that she can cope. So, we worked on first and then, taking one little brief turn at a time. And literally, she let me like sit her doll on the floor, or, literally kind of half a meter from where she had sat the doll. And gradually, with those tiny, tiny steps of turn taking and sharing, she was able to develop a little bit more flexibility. And then obviously these are only real names in situations where families have given permission. But then there's Lexi, and she's busy with her own tasks. And so long as you don't try and interfere, then you'll get along just fine. Unless, of course, she does want your help. And that will need to be immediate and precisely what is requested. And she'll do that by pointing and gesturing, and she doesn't currently use any verbal language. She is finding a schedule, and we'll have a look at a couple of those in a minute, and a choice board really helpful. So she's starting to engage with some supportive strategies as well. And then there's Eloise, who will write everything down that you say. She is everyone's PA and everyone's bestest ever friend. She can't bear it if she reads a curious or pensive face as upset, and she'll burst into tears readily if she thinks anyone is in the slightest way unhappy. And I think that's like a really kind of important point to just pick up on, because it challenges that stereotypical sort of maybe old diagnostic framework of autism, where people would say, oh, well, she can't be autistic because she's so sensitive, or she can't be autistic because she looks at you directly in the eye, she makes eye contact. And of course, there are so many confusing myths around autism out there that it's not surprising that we find ourselves sometimes completely at sea with, well, what is it that is relevant and what is it that isn't relevant? And of course, we don't have time today to go into all of that detail and nitty-gritty around that. But as I say, if anyone does want to contact, then please do so. But also it's worth sort of looking on the National Autistic Society website at some of the information around diagnosis and what is it that perhaps would point towards support and help. And of course, some of you who have attended my training might have, excuse me a minute, might have met my, well, I just retrieve Rosie here, and she's been useful. And sometimes, using puppets, using sort of a third party can be really helpful. I remember taking her into a home of a 9-year-old recently, and the 9-year-old, and she had a hand like this sort of covered over her face, and then I usually sort of take them off, and then she kind of says, hello, and gets a little bit more sort of chatty and lively. And when she had her hands like this over her face, this 9-year-old little girl said, oh, she looks just how I feel. And so sometimes, having these kind of extra vehicles to help to open up and talk about how our girls are feeling, talk about what their experiences are and how we can support those experiences, can be a really sort of helpful way of supporting opening up and taking that mask off, removing that mask. And I know Maisie, another little girl who she keeps herself sort of very much to herself, and she's recently stopped joining the family for meals. This is a teenage girl, and it was obviously causing the family great concern, and there's worry around her sort of, they don't want to sort of stop her from not eating unless she comes down to the kitchen in case she actually stops eating altogether, because of course they are all kind of other additional concerns as well. And so they've made a compromise, which is currently that she's choosing which meal time she'll join the family for dessert. Luckily, she's a bit like me and obviously a bit of a sucker for a pudding, so that's good. And then in our final picture there, we've got Mel, and she's discovered football. It's a bit of a lifesaver for her, and she mentioned recently in an email that she's able to speak when she's totally relaxed, which is never in a social setting and never with people she doesn't know well. So football has been a real vehicle for her, because she said, she can really kind of just get stuck in, and there's no call for lots of language. So that's been a really great sport for her. So you can just see from the experiences of these, 5 young women here, that actually the spectrum is unpredictable, it's inconsistent, and it's experienced uniquely and individually, as life is for any girl, really, if we're honest. And I think the commonality for us all is that value in finding the groove, finding what our girls love, what they like, what they enjoy, and helping them to access those right strategies to sort of manage the sort of rest of, life's waves, and make sure that there is, experienced and qualified support in place as well. And I know, that's kind of opens up a whole can of worms for lots of situations, but there's nothing wrong in checking out that the people that your daughter is referred to, that the people that you're talking to have got a good experience of autism. And I think it is even more important when we're talking about girls, because we are also up against it with this more sort of traditional media and society's idea of what autism does and doesn't look like, as we've mentioned at the start of our webinar today. So strategies, are they as simple as pretty and engaging schedules? For some, absolutely. And this little dressing schedule here, as long as it was on sparkly pink glitter paper, then the little girl who it was made for absolutely loved it and got on really well with it. So, but for some, we need to be a little bit more personalized. We need to make sure that we are using strategies that are very individual and very appealing to that personal little girl. So it might be that for some people, for some of our girls, having a schedule or a strategy that is very dictating and very sort of very directive can actually upset things and make life a little bit more difficult than we are intending. And it might be that we need something that's a little bit more like lucky dip, or a little bit more fun and a little bit more unpredictable and a bit more interactive. And again, that challenges this preconception, this notion of autism requiring predictability, routine, structure. And of course, for lots of people, all of those things are really fabulous and really helpful. But actually, for other people, having that amount of predictability, having that amount of knowledge in place can in itself be overwhelming and can promote lots of anxiety. So what we want to be doing is really knowing our girls well. And so it's vitally important that we do make sure that what we have in place relieves anxiety. And sometimes it is a case of less is often more. And I think when it comes to the need tos in life, I know in the book PDA for PDAers, Sally Catt, the author, says that it is remarkable. She remarks on control is not about wanting power over others. It is rooted in feeling safe by controlling one's own environment in order to sense and achieve a sense of calm. And I think, that is a really valid point, that actually sometimes we misinterpret and we give those assumptions that I mentioned earlier of bossy and, precocious sometimes. But actually what we're seeing, what we are missing perhaps, is a cry for relief of anxiety, for taking that anxiety level to a much more tolerable point. And I know, Girls and Autism by Barry Carpenter, he quotes one of my favorite people in there, Frankie Happy, who's saying, strategy is like simply creating and finding a girls group where our girls can mix and spend time learning together and understanding that, our girls sort of often do mask difficulties. And so, choosing to copy and mimic and mirror others' reactions can often get themselves into sort of endless difficult social situations that school does present. And of course, I'm saying choosing to, it's not a choice, it's an inherent need to try and reduce anxiety, to try and make things feel really tolerable. Because of course, you know, if you are living in a situation where from quite a young age, you spend a lot of time where you feel perhaps wrong-footed, or that you don't quite fit in, or people laugh when you weren't intending to be funny and don't laugh when you were trying to be funny. You don't necessarily get their jokes and they kind of don't understand how you tick. And I think that really emphasizes the importance on us really working hard to point out those valuable strategies that our girls have, that we, you know, praise and raise our girls up to be the individuals that they really deserve to be, and that we support them and affirm them in the characteristics and the skills and abilities that they do have, and that we don't ourselves hide or mirror or mask our parenting or our way forward with them, that we're out there, that we don't mind having, you know, schedules and reminders and sticky notes saying how great they are, that we'll have those things around the house and we're not shying away from other people noticing, or, you know, what will people think, that we're actually embracing the fact that we know that for many of our girls, these kinds of strategies, because they're a little bit more covert and not so in your face, can feel much more comfortable. And of course, for some of our girls, we can be much more full on. You know, those two examples there on the slide of similar strategies, but with a very different approach, just really highlight that fact that for some of our girls, we might need to be a little bit more fun, a little bit more sort of, I always say, kind of coming through the back door with things. So we might do more generalized ways of offering praise and highlighting what they're great at. So, you know, we might have a high five. I saw recently a fabulous thing where a family had just drawn around their hand on the fridge with a white chalk pen, and they had a high five in there, and every day someone wrote in who deserved a high five and what for. So a very gentle kind of, you know, way of giving praise, but not being so full on that it feels too intense to cope with. And we're really sort of moving away from masking. You know, we're modeling openness, we're modeling not pretending, we're modeling what life is really like for all of us. And I think before we finish today, just to highlight sort of one other point, and that is to say that there's a real value and a real importance in us being open when we are experiencing things. So commenting that actually, you know, I felt a bit nervous actually, you know, starting the webinar. And, you know, I feel anxious when I've got to go and meet somebody I don't know. And, you know, I spoke to a mum just this week actually, and she said her little boy, they were going to a birthday party and they didn't really know anybody. And a little boy said, you know, he didn't really want to go. And the mum said, well, do you know, I feel a bit the same because I don't really know any of the other mummies either. So let's hold hands and go in together. And I think, you know, sometimes that whole kind of camaraderie and that sharing the fact that actually we're experiencing similar emotions, we're having similar thoughts. And because of the way cognitively our autistic girls' brains are wired, then sometimes they're not already automatically aware of the fact that we may well be sharing similar worries, similar concerns. I know in university, I've been supporting a young lady, and she wasn't aware that other people had the same kind of concerns about completing assignments. But at the same time, she also wasn't aware about the length of time to spend on an assignment and when to spend that time on the assignment. And she was, you know, she wasn't just doing a one-off all night cramming everything in before handing date. You know, she was doing lots of that and getting physically and emotionally burnt out and exhausted. So, you know, being aware of what do our girls know about this situation that we perhaps just know. And I know that's something that I often flag up when we're doing face-to-face training. You know, there's so much just know knowledge socially that goes on in our life that sometimes we're in real danger of overlooking it. So I think sort of, you know, top tips before we finish are really very much about personalizing the strategies that we do use, using as much visual support to help not just with predicting and giving information about what we would like to be happening, but also in terms of giving praise, of highlighting skills, highlighting abilities, and being very much mindful of the information that we just have on board because of our own social experiences. And remembering that our girls sometimes will be maybe recalling things differently because of an outside sort of experience, an overwhelming experience that they may well have had. So just being, I think, mindful and supportive and offering lots of praise and noticing those abilities that our girls have is a really good starting point. And if you do feel after today or maybe before today that it's worth pursuing a diagnosis or certainly an assessment, then don't be put off. As I had a family recently who were told by their doctor to go to school and told by their school to go to the doctor. You have a right for an assessment and you can start that ball rolling as a parent or, you know, as a concerned carer of a significant significant person in that child's life. You absolutely have a right to an assessment. So do go and see your doctor and don't be put off if you have got any concerns. And thank you for listening, and thank you for logging in. As I say, if there is any further information or support that you might like, please don't hesitate to contact me via Witherslack or directly with Ideas Afresh. Thank you.